substitute for victory.
Let us never negotiate out of fear.
We stand undivided, forever united, fighting hand in hand for the liberty we burn, for glory and honor, for our sons and daughters, ever mindful of the lessons we've learned. Let the torch of freedom burn.
Calvin Coolidge said, "The more I study the Constitution, the more I realize that no other document devised by the hand of man has brought so much progress and happiness to humanity. To live under the American Constitution is the greatest political privilege that was ever accorded to the human race."
Well, welcome to WallBuilders Live. It is Foundations of Freedom Thursday time. That means we're going to dive into some questions about our Constitution and Declaration, but also some of the laws that we've passed over the years. And, David, we got a question via email this week. I love getting the questions. You do as well. Let's encourage folks to send those in. Radio@wallbuilders.com is the place to send them. You might have, a question about a founding father or the founding documents, or maybe even, in this case, a law that was passed 50 years ago, the Civil Rights Act of '64. This question comes from Brady Smith. He says, "I love listening to the show, always informative and encouraging. My question has to do with the Civil Rights Act of '64. Recently, the area where I live has had several municipalities pass anti-discrimination laws that included, quote, gender identity, unquote, and, quote, sexual preference, unquote. This is obviously very disturbing, and I've been working on getting these laws removed. But my question is whether or not the Civil Rights Act of '64 was a bad law. In other words, is it government's place to tell citizens who they can and can't, quote, discriminate against? And how would the removal of the Civil Rights Act affect voting?" Sorry for the length of this. Hope it makes sense. Have a great day, and thank you very much. Brady Smith, thank you for sending that in. It is a long question, David, but it's a good question. How do we, give us a little background first just on the Civil Rights Act of '64 and whether or not it was meant to be applied to, gender identity and some of these crazy things happening today.
Yeah, the Civil Rights Act of '64 is a bookend with the Voting Rights Act of '65. You really cannot separate those two acts. They are part of the same initiative, the same movement, the same purpose, the same objective. And what they are is they both have reference to something that happened almost 80 years earlier. So to understand what the Civil Rights Act of '64 is about and what the Voting Rights Act of '65 is about, you have to go back to the constitutional amendment that engendered both of these laws. That constitutional amendment is specifically the 14th Amendment. Now, the 14th Amendment, to put it in its perspective, you have to understand the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment because they all passed in quick succession within 5 years of one another. The quickest passing block of amendments we had in the Constitution except for the original Bill of Rights. So these amendments, 13th, 14th, and 15th, came at the end of the Civil War and after the Civil War. And the 13th Amendment said slavery is abolished. No more involuntary servitude unless it happens to be in prison or something else. You can hold someone involuntarily in servitude if they have a 20-year jail sentence or something. But racial slavery is over. We're not going to have people held in servitude in slavery. So that's the 13th Amendment. Now, what happened was, particularly in the South, the 11 southern states that had seceded, they said, okay, great, blacks are free, but they're not citizens of our state. So we have state laws that say you have to be white to be able to marry, you have to be white to be able to get an education, you have to be able to, you have to be white to vote, you can't carry guns or knives or arms, you can't defend yourself unless you're white, you can't testify in juries and courts of law unless you're white. And it says, great, slaves are free, but they get no rights in our state. 14th Amendment came along and said, no, wait, we just told you everybody's free. Now we're telling you in the 14th Amendment that anyone that is a former slave, any one state gets to enjoy all the rights of a citizen of that state. And specifically, let me just read you what the 14th Amendment says. It says, all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. Now, that's the deal. All right, blacks used to be slaves. They're now citizens of the United States. They're also citizens of the state in which they reside. And as citizens of the United States, you can't live in a state and say, hey, you don't get any rights. You can't do that. And if there are rights given in your state to anybody else, then these folks get the rights as well. So that's the constitutional amendment. Now, that's the 14th Amendment. And then you had specifically the same 11 states down in those Democrat-controlled Confederate states. They said, well, you know what, all right, we got to do that, but voting, that's a privilege that we can control. And so the 15th Amendment was passed to say, no, you cannot stop anyone from voting in any means, way, shape, fashion, or form. So that is the general overview of what led to the 1964 Civil Rights Act and the 1965 Voting Rights Act. But both of those laws were to try to help to enforce what had been intended by the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, but quite frankly, they were laws that were ignored by those southern states for nearly 80 years after the passage of those constitutional amendments.
All right, so that's the Civil Rights Acts, both of 64 and 65. Got to take a quick break. Got a question for Dave when we come back. Stay with us here on WallBuilders Live.
President Thomas Jefferson said, "I know no safe depository of the ultimate powers of the society, but the people themselves. And if we think them not enlightened enough to exercise their control with a wholesome discretion, the remedy is not to take it from them, but to inform their discretion by education. This is the true corrective of abuses of constitutional power."
This is David Barton with another moment from America's history. The key to a self-governing nation is self-governing people, and the key to personal self-government is to live by the standards in God's Word. If someone cannot control himself by those standards, then our Constitution certainly will be unable to restrain him. Understanding this, John Adams declared, "We have no government armed with power capable of contending with human passions unbridled by morality and religion. Greed, ambition, revenge, or seduction would break the strongest cords of our Constitution as a whale goes through a net. Our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other." John Adams believed that successful government rested not upon our great Constitution, but rather upon moral and religious people.
For more information on God's hand in American history, contact WallBuilders at 1-800-8-REBUILD.
Let the torch of freedom burn.
Abraham Lincoln said, "We the people are the rightful masters of both Congress and the courts, not to overthrow the Constitution, but to overthrow the men who pervert the Constitution."
Welcome back. Thanks for staying with us here on WallBuilders Live. It's Thursday, so it's Foundations of Freedom Thursday. And our question this week, our first question of the week, is about the Civil Rights Act of 64. And David, as you were pointing out, also Civil Rights Act of 65. And the purpose here was to really enforce the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution. I was just wondering, from your perspective, do you think it was, when we run into these situations where states are violating the Constitution, do we need a new federal law to enforce that? Do you think that was the right move here? Or do you think it would have been better if we just said, hey, we're going to enforce the Constitution itself? Or did this help clarify where the states were violating?
Well, let's talk about it from the constitutional standpoint. What's the right thing the federal government can do here? And what you have is, I read Section 1 of the 14th Amendment that says, hey, if you're a citizen of the United States, then you get the rights of a citizen of the United States and of the state wherein you reside. You get the equal protection of laws, and no one can be deprived of any of their inalienable rights. So you take that, well, go to Section 5 of the 14th Amendment. It says, the Congress shall have power to enforce by appropriate legislation the provisions of this article. Now, that just gave the Congress the right to pass the Civil Rights Act of 64 and the Voting Rights Act of 65. But here's a question that goes with that. Why did Congress feel like it needed to do that? After all, they had the 14th Amendment. So what more do you need than the 14th Amendment? And here's where the answer gets interesting with the background of history. With the background of history, when you look at what happened, the Civil Rights Acts, these amendments were passed by Republicans, hands down. For example, there was not a single Democrat in Congress who voted to end slavery. As you get into the 14th Amendment, overwhelmingly, I think there was only a handful of Democrats. I have the exact numbers, but it's a tiny handful of Democrats who voted to give equal rights to freed slaves. And voting rights was the same thing. Democrats voted overwhelmingly against it. So in the period of time when Republicans had control of the presidency, the House and Senate, they passed some 23 civil rights laws. They opened up juries, they opened up education, they opened up marriage, they opened up the right to keep and bear arms, did all this stuff. And that went pretty well until 1876, which is the official end of Reconstruction. Because of voter fraud and corruption in 3 states that was alleged, the election got thrown into a real quandary, and they actually negotiated it, and Democrats said, well, we'll concede these 3 states, and literally what you had was, I mean, really hardcore voting corruption in 3 Democrat states. But Democrats said, we'll give you those 3 states if you'll pull the federal troops out of the South. If you take the Reconstruction troops out. And the Reconstruction troops are there to keep the KKK pushed back and to protect the rights of blacks, because quite frankly, the KKK was started and specifically said it was to repress Republicans. So if you look at the lynchings that were held all the way from, say, 1882 until about 1962, you've got about 4,800 lynchings that happened in America, but 3,500 of them were blacks and 1,300 of them were whites. You had about 1/3 to 1/4 of the lynchings being whites, because it was often white senators, white representatives, white guys in Congress that were Republicans that were getting lynched. So the KKK wasn't just after blacks, it was after Republicans. And it just happened that if you were black, you were Republican in that day. And you couldn't kill every white you saw, because some of them might be Democrats. And so the federal troops were there to stop that kind of nonsense. But
and this, by the way, David, I mean, this, for anybody that's a new listener to WallBuilders Live, this is going to be shocking information to them, because we don't teach this in the classrooms anymore. So I would encourage folks, for the documentation that backs up all of this. It's in a book called American History in Black and White, Setting the Record Straight, that you put out, I guess, probably 5-6 years ago. Incredible data in that, and also a DVD that tells the story of a lot of these folks. So check that out on our website at wallbuilders.com. It's called American History in Black and White. Sorry to interrupt you, David,
no,
but I know
but that's important.
Sometimes I listen to these amazing facts come out of your mouth, and I know that some of our audience have their jaw open right now going, what? So I wanted to get those details.
The cool thing is we own the documents, and we have the footnotes, and we actually in this book reproduced and copied a number of the documents. For example, the 13-volume set in the congressional records of the Klan hearings that happened, I think it was from 1868 to 1876. You read through that and see what both parties admit, and the Democrats openly admit, yeah, the Klan's our folks. We're the ones who started it, and that's exactly why and so all this is in hearings. So it's all real easy to document. It's all there. But as a result of that, once the federal troops were pulled out, then the Democrats now regained control of the South. And by the way, when the federal troops were there, you could stop voting corruption, and that's when blacks were elected to office. The first 41 blacks elected to a state house, to a state legislature in Texas, were all Republicans. The first 137 blacks elected in Louisiana were all Republicans. The first 112 blacks in Mississippi, the first 99 blacks in Alabama, the first 41 blacks in Georgia, the first 190 blacks in South Carolina, they're all Republicans. Well, now when you lose Reconstruction, the federal troops are pulled out, suddenly blacks, you just can't elect them anymore. You can't get it done. And so the Democrats institute what they call white-only primaries. The Supreme Court upheld that policy of Democrats, and so that keeps blacks off the ballot. And you can't run blacks. And Republicans have been gerrymandered and redistricted in such a way by Democrat legislatures that blacks can't win. And so as the Democrats get control, and by the way, Democrats also got control again of Congress, House, Senate, President in 1893. In 1876, Republicans lost one of the bodies, the House and Senate, and so they had a split Congress from 1876 to 1893. No more civil rights laws passed in Congress in that period of time. In 1893, when the Democrats regained the House and the Senate and the presidency under Grover Cleveland, they promptly started repealing those 23 civil rights acts that had been passed. So the Democrats have a very clear record of opposing blacks and voting and all the rights. So in the southern states, particularly those 11 states that were there, what happened in those 11 states was they came up with about a dozen different ways to keep blacks from participating in the civil process. One of the things, for example, they used was they said, well, blacks can vote. I mean, 15th Amendment says you can vote. All you have to do is pass a literacy test. Now, a literacy test is not can you read. Read this sentence. The literacy test, for example, we have a literacy test out of Alabama. It's 21 pages long. And the literacy test asks questions like this. It says, what rights do you have as part of a grand jury that you do not have as part of a criminal jury? Now, I bet you most judges can't answer that. I bet you most attorneys can't answer that.
That's right.
You take 21 pages of those kind of questions, blacks just aren't qualified to vote, but only the blacks had to take the test. No whites had to take the test. They also used the whites-only primaries we talked about. They also used poll taxes. They said, well, blacks have to pay a tax to vote, but nobody else does, and the tax is so high, blacks just can't afford to vote. They used what were called hide-and-seek ballots. Hide-and-seek ballots, a black would go to vote, but it turned out to be a different place from where whites vote, but every hour they moved the polling location. So you're always trying to find where the polling is for blacks, and you can't get there and can't find it, and they keep moving it. They also used what were called multiple ballots. Well, if you want a state rep, you vote in this ballot over here, but you got to have a totally different location, totally different ballot to vote for a state senator. And if you're voting for mayor, you got to go over here. And so they made it as hard as they could for blacks to vote. And that's the civil rights was the same thing. Maybe you get the right to keep and bear arms, but we're going to regulate that by the state. So what happened in this period of time, you have Democrats that really came through in an onerous way, and they went after blacks to prevent them from voting. So let me take you up to the 64-65 time period. Even though we have the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, let's take Mississippi. Almost 70,000 more blacks than there were whites in Mississippi, but white voters outnumbered black voters by a margin of 8-1. Now, how do you do that when there's more blacks than whites in the state? Well, you do that because of these stupid kind of Jim Crow laws. In the city of Birmingham, of the 18,000 blacks who lived in Birmingham, only 30 of them were qualified to vote.
Wow.
In Texas,
and again, done by Democrats.
Done by Democrats.
Make sure that these are
In Texas, and by the way, most Southern Republican parties have no clue. But for example, the Texas Republican Party was started in July the 4th of 1868 by 150 blacks and 20 whites. The first three Republican chairmen of the Republican Party of Texas, two of the three were black. I mean, that's the way Southern Republican parties were. They were started by blacks. And so as now the Democrats are trying to whack Republicans because Republicans are largely black, what you find is in Texas, when Republicans had control in Texas till 1876, you had 100,000 black voters. Once the Democrats took control of Texas after Reconstruction was over, you only had 5,000 black voters. Same thing in Alabama and Florida. The black voter rolls were reduced by 90%. And by the 1940s, only 5% of blacks in the South were registered to vote. And so
this is the environment then. This is what they were facing in the 60s.
You bet.
The result of the Democrats and their anti-black policies. So this is what they were trying to change in the 60s and trying to reverse. They were dealing with the incredibly anti-black policies of the Democrats in the South and trying to change that, and they had to pass federal laws in order to enforce the Constitution itself. We've got to take a quick break. We'll be back with more on this when we return here on WallBuilders Live.
John Adams said, "Our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other."
The federal government is without question out of control in its growth outside of its limited jurisdiction as defined by our founding fathers. The question is, How do we get them back in check? How do we get our government back into its proper jurisdictional responsibilities? Well, some people are proposing a convention of states. It's something found in Article 5 of the Constitution, and I've heard good people on both sides of this. Some talking about how great it would be and how it could help to get the federal government in check. Others saying that it's a bad idea. Well, here at WallBuilders, we look at things from both a historical and a biblical point of view, and that's what we're going to do. We're going to analyze this issue of a convention of states. It's going to take place in a live webinar where you're going to have the opportunity to ask questions. Join us on June 19th, at the evening of June 19th at 8 o'clock Central Time. That's going to be 6 on the West Coast, 9 on the East Coast. Join us in this live webinar where you can ask questions, and we'll be discussing this issue of a convention of states. You can find out more information right now, and you can register for the webinar at wallbuilderslive.com.
Let the torch of freedom burn.
Thomas Jefferson said, "The constitutions of most of our states and of the United States assert that all power is inherent in the people, that they may exercise it by themselves, that is their right and duty, to be at all times armed, and that they are entitled to freedom of person, freedom of religion, freedom of property, and freedom of press."
Welcome back to WallBuilders Live. It's Foundations of Freedom Thursday. Our question today from the audience has to do with the Civil Rights Act of 64 and 65 and the misapplication of that to gender identity and some of these things. But we've just been going back to why the Civil Rights Act was necessary to enforce the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. And David, I have to ask you a question, because it was Democrats that had put the nation in this position, and in the South had prevented Republicans and blacks from voting. Isn't it true that Eisenhower had tried to do something during his presidency and couldn't get the Democrats in Congress to move? Why was it that did Johnson just, when he finally pushed on this, was it because he realized his party, that they were going to have to change on this or it was going to destroy them? And how did he manage to do it?
Well, I'll tell you, there were several courageous Democrats who stood up and did some things against their own party, not the least of which was Harry Truman. Harry Truman desegregates the military back in World War II. That was absolutely against what his party wanted. They actually ran people against him in the primary. That's where Strom Thurmond came in as the Dixiecrats, because here you have a Democrat president going against their platform, against their policies, and against their policies in the South. So it really did split the Democrat Party in many ways, but Harry Truman had a lot of guts. And Harry Truman was pretty much raised as a racist, and he had the courage and the guts to get out of that, to go in the other direction, recognize all men are created equal. And so Truman's a good example. Eisenhower came along. Eisenhower also desegregated the military as well. And he was, of course, the follower to Truman. And Eisenhower is the one who is the first executive to put blacks in prominent positions in the White House. And so that's what Eisenhower did. He also introduced the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. But they were killed by Democrats in the House and Senate. Committee chairman killed those bills and continued that direction. Kennedy becomes president in 1961. By 1963, you're having the riots in Birmingham. And Kennedy says, look, we got to pass the civil rights stuff. And so he has to take on his own party to do it. Well, he gets assassinated before any of this happens. LBJ picks it up and says, we've got to do this. And he pushes it on through. Now, when you get to the point of voting for the Civil Rights Act of 64 and the Voting Rights Act of 65, Democrats had more than two-thirds of the House and Senate. It only takes a majority to be able to get this passed, and they could not get a majority of their own guys. You had a much higher percentage of Republicans that voted for the bill than the Democrats voted for this bill. And it literally was Eisenhower's bill that the Democrats had killed, that first Kennedy brought up and then LBJ brought up and got passed. So the question is, did it really need to be done? And the answer is absolutely yes. As a matter of fact, in 65, when this passed, in Selma, Alabama, where you have more black residents and white residents, the voting rolls in Selma in 65 were 99% white and 1% black, and yet there's more blacks in the city than whites. So the laws didn't need to be passed. Now, do they pertain to sexual identity and gender orientation? Absolutely not. That was not the intent of them. That's not the history of them. But as the courts often do, if you'll just stand on your left foot and contort your face to the right, and if you'll twist in the right direction, you can maybe see something that comes up in the Constitution that looks like that. And that's where the concoction has been. And so the courts have a tendency to exercise judicial activism when they ignore history and they ignore original intent. So they're really doing what Jefferson warned about in terms of waxing the hands of the judiciary. They're just molding this into what they want, which is not what the original intent was of these acts themselves. That's right. They've taken a screwdriver and turned it into a shovel, and that was never the intent of the screwdriver. And so were these acts needed and necessary? Yes. Are they constitutional? Absolutely. Section 5 of the 14th Amendment says Congress has the right to enforce. And when you look at what were happening in these 11 Southern Democrat states with poll taxes and grandfather clauses and property requirements and things being put on blacks that weren't there for whites, it was absolutely the right thing for Congress to do. But that is not what is going with sexual orientation or gender identity or misidentity or anything else that's out there. So that would be the historical background for why the 64 and 65 acts were a good thing. Well, I wish we had more time to talk about the misapplication of it. We'll cover that in future programs. But, man, what a great history on this. And really encourage our listeners, check out American History in Black and White. It will absolutely blow your mind. There's so much fascinating information in that book that you did, David. Setting the Record Straight. American History in Black and White, Setting the Record Straight. Both a book and a DVD available at WallBuilders.com, and a great one to share with others that probably know none of this history. We've really been lied to a lot on this issue of civil rights, and it's been twisted into something very different than what actually happened at the time. So check it all out at WallBuilders.com. We sure appreciate you listening today to WallBuilders Live with David Barton and Rick Green.
Thomas Jefferson said, "The Constitution of most of our states and of the United States assert that all power is inherent in the people, that they may exercise it by themselves, that it is their right and duty to be at all times armed, that they are entitled to freedom of person, freedom of religion, freedom of property, and freedom of press."